The second dualist to talk about is a man named Zeno. Zeno argues that in the physical universe, nothing ever changes. Motion is impossible. Nothing ever moves or changes in the physical universe. But we find ourselves bored living in a physical universe where things don't change or move, and so we pretend that we live in a world where things change and motion is possible, when in fact around us the physical universe always stays the same. Zeno makes this argument by demonstrating to you that when you begin to describe what you think you see going on around you, when you begin to describe your experience of moving or of things moving around you, that you get yourself tied up in all kinds of contradictions, and you get yourself tied up in all kinds of knots, and that in fact there's no way that you can accurately describe what you claim to see going on around you in the physical universe. Zeno's the master of setting you up. He'll get you to agree with something and then show how what you're agreeing to can't be true. For example, if Zeno were making this demonstration to you today, he might say, he might ask you a question. For me to get from Ocala to Jacksonville, I've got to get halfway to Jacksonville first. Right? Well, let me think. If I'm driving from Ocala to Jacksonville, well, before I get to Jacksonville, I've got to get halfway to Jacksonville first. Kind of makes sense to me. It's fairly obvious that for me to get from Ocala to Jacksonville, I have to get halfway to Jacksonville first. Well, of course that's true. It seems obvious. But in fact, isn't it also true that for me to get from Ocala to Jacksonville, I have to get a quarter of the way to Jacksonville first? Well, that's true too. But now both those statements can't be true. It can't be true that I have to get halfway to Jacksonville first, and that I have to get a quarter of the way to Jacksonville first. They can't both be true, because I can only get to one of these points first. I can't get to both of them first. So which point do I have to get to first? The halfway point or the quarter wave point? Okay, I guess I've got to get a quarter of the way there first. That's true. So when I said that I have to get halfway to Jacksonville first, in fact that wasn't true. So now I'm saying that that wasn't true. But it is true now. Now I know. I have to get a quarter of the way to Jacksonville first. But now isn't it also true that before I get to Jacksonville, I've got to get an eighth of the way to Jacksonville first? Well, that's true too. But they both can't be true. So I guess, when I just said I have to get a quarter of the way to Jacksonville first, that wasn't true. But now I know where I have to get to first to get to Jacksonville. I've got to get an eighth of the way to Jacksonville. But now that I think about it, it's also true I have to get a 16th of the way to Jacksonville first. And I can't get to both of those places first either. So where do I have to go first? And you begin to see the problem. Here's Zeno's problem here. For me to get from A to B, I have to get halfway there first. Well, of course you do. That seems fairly obvious. Of course that's true. If you have to get from A to B, you have to get halfway there first. But in fact, that's not true, because you have to get a quarter of the way there first. But in fact, that's not true either. You have to get an eighth of the way there first. But that's not true either. You have to get a 16th of the way there first, and that's not true either. You have to get a 32nd of the way there first, and that's not true either. You have to get a 64th of the way there first, and that's not true either. Well, which point do you have to get to first? Well, the first one. That's your problem. There is no first point. Because every time you point at a spot on the map and say you have to get there first, there's another point in between that you have to get to first. And Zeno says, look, if you can't even tell me where I have to get to first, There's no way you can tell me I can get all the way to Jacksonville. You can't even tell me where I got to go first. Because how many points are there on a line between Ocala and Jacksonville? Think back to geometry class. How many points are there on a straight line, or any line at all? How many points are there on a line? That's right, an infinite number of points. And if you point at one line, point at one point, and say, that's where I have to get to first, there's always another point you didn't get to first. And Zeno says, if you can't even describe to me how you get from Ocala to Jacksonville, then you don't get from Ocala to Jacksonville. You can't even tell me where to go first. And Zeno's right. Zeno is right. If you agree that you have to get to the halfway point first, well, then you're stuck. Literally, you're stuck. You can't move. Because there's always another point you have to get to first. And Zeno's right. Just so you know, well, this is an example of what are called Zeno's paradoxes. A paradox is when you believe two things to be true, but they both can't be true. Is it true that before I get to Jacksonville, I have to get halfway there first? Yes. Is it true that before I get from Ocala to Jacksonville, I have to get a quarter of the way there first? Yes. Well, which point do I have to get to first? Because I can't be in two places at once. Zeno's right. If you say there's a point you have to get to first, then you're stuck. Just so you know, there's a solution to Zeno's paradox here. The paradox really has nothing to do with moving from Ocala to Jacksonville. It has to do with the words that we use to describe it. Because if you say that you have to get to the halfway point first before you can get to Jacksonville, well, in fact, that's not true. But if you say that you have to pass through the halfway point as you move to Jacksonville, there's no problem at all. It's the little difference between the prepositions to and through. But Zeno's right. He's the master of setting you up. If you let Zeno set you up, he will get you every time. Zeno has a number of different paradoxes. You'll probably come across these paradoxes often in your college career. Different professors use them for different purposes to illustrate different things. Zeno has a paradox about, this is just a cartoon about Zeno's paradox I forgot to show you. But he is right. He is right. If you insist on putting marks down on the line and getting to one mark first, well, then you can't move. He is right. Zeno has another paradox about an arrow. He says you've seen arrows in flight, but the arrow never moves because you can't describe how the arrow moves. And here's Zeno's arrow paradox. Zeno says the arrow is moving, right? Of course. I see the arrow moving. Well, can the arrow be in two different places at the same time? Well, no. In fact, can anything be in two different places at the same time? Well, in the physical universe, no. In the physical universe, it seems that physical objects can only be in one place at one time. Physical objects in the physical universe can only be in one place at one time. Well, of course. Well, as we think about the arrow traveling across the field, at every point in time, the arrow can only be in one place. In other words, there's no point in time in which the arrow is moving. For example, 1 second into flight, the arrow is here. 2 seconds into flight, the arrow is here. Or it will be once the computer wakes up. There we go. At 1 second, the arrow is in the upper left-hand corner. At second number 2, the arrow is in the bottom right-hand corner. Well, at what point in time did the arrow get from point A to point B? Half a second. But at that point in time, the arrow was right there. At what point in time did the arrow get from the first place to the second place? Oh, halfway there. No, because at that point in time, the arrow was only in one place. It was there. When did the arrow get from the first place to the second place? And you start to see Zeno's problem. Or you start to see your problem, since you agreed with Zeno that physical objects can't be in two different places at the same time. Well, there are a number of solutions to Zeno's paradoxes. He has an awful lot of them. He's got another paradox about... oh, I forgot about this cartoon. What's with me and cartoons today? Here's Zeno making, as a lawyer, Zeno making the argument that his client couldn't kill anyone with an arrow because he can prove that the arrow never moved. And the judge asks him to approach the bench to present his evidence, and well, you see Zeno's problem here. He has a number of different paradoxes. He's got one about a turtle who challenges a man to a foot race, and the turtle wins every time. And you think, well, that can't happen. And Zeno says, well, get out a pencil and paper and do the math, and as it turns out, the turtle wins every time. What are you going to believe, your experience or your reason? What are you going to believe, what your eyes tell you or what math tells you? Well, those are some big questions. Now, Zeno's paradox, these paradoxes are pretty high-octane stuff. I can go ahead and tell you there won't be an essay exam on the first midterm, won't be an essay question on the first midterm exam that says define and refute Zeno's paradox. But if you go through and think about Zeno's paradoxes, you'll see that he is right. He is right. If you're interested in these kind of mind games, you can find them online very easily and see descriptions of them and try to work your way through these kind of mind games. But if you let Zeno set you up, he'll set you up every time. So again, you don't need to be too concerned about grasping every detail of Zeno's argument here. But you want to know Zeno's name. You want to know that he takes the exact opposite position that Heraclitus does. You want to know that Zeno's position is that in the physical universe nothing ever changes. You want to know that he is famous for his paradoxes, where he sets you up with these stories, and then as you try to explain what you claim is going on, you find out that Zeno has set you up. Well, that's going to be the last of the pre-Socratics we're going to talk about, and we're going to be turning our attention pretty quickly to the first philosopher after the pre-Socratics, and of course that's Socrates.